For the last month and a half, there has been an encampment at McGill University, and in the last month there have been many developments around not just the McGill encampment but other encampments. So what has happened in the last month? Essentially, within the last month, there have been 3 encampments in Montreal. First, the McGill encampment. Then second, an encampment opened up at UQAM, which was later closed. And now there is a 3rd encampment that just opened this past Saturday at Square Victoria in downtown Montreal. This encampment is called the Al-Soumoud encampment. Essentially what happened at UQAM, which was a very short-lived encampment, it lasted around less than a month, is that students there were demanding for the university administration to vote and essentially have it enshrined within their policy that they would not have any future ties with Israel, because at the moment of the encampment, UQAM did not have any investments in Israel, but students wanted to mobilize for a more long-term pressure to ensure that the university would not develop any ties with Israel. Let's take a closer look at the UQAM encampment.
I've received a tour at both McGill's Gaza Solidarity Encampment and UQAM's Gaza Solidarity Encampment. Both encampments are quite similar to one another in the sense that they house numerous tents. They even have specific tents such as a medic's tent, and they accept donations from the community. Unlike McGill, UQAM says that it does not have ties with Israeli companies. But students within this encampment says that UQAM supports Quebec opening an office in Tel Aviv and has ties with Israeli universities. UQAM denies these ties, but did not respond to the request for comment on its support for opening an office in Tel Aviv. UQAM was recently called out on X by Israel's Consul General Paul Herson, who lives in Montreal. He says that UQAM is cowardice in their dealings with members of the encampment, or what he calls supporters of the Hamas death cult.
The hearing for the injunction is currently underway in the Palais de Justice in downtown Montreal.
We do have one more clip looking at the closing of the UQAM encampment. Essentially, this is Niall Ricardo Clapham, who spoke to journalists at the time and said that, essentially the UQAM administration had voted in support of campers' demands, and there was an agreement between both the students at the encampment and the administration, and there was no longer a need to have the encampment set up at UQAM anymore. So we can take a look at that.
The camp has come to an understanding with the administration of the university. The demands that have been put forward by us were very simple, right? We wanted disclosure to investment like we were seeing at McGill too, but we also wanted to go further than that and have an academic boycott. There's this important meeting with the Academic Council on June 4th. It's pending the decision of the Academic Council, which means UQAM has to take this step on June 4th, and that's when the totality of the camp, after that, we're talking about June 6th, totality of the camp will be dismantled. So it's progressive.
The main demand is to make sure that UQAM stands on the right side of history and also stands on the side of oppressed people, even if we have to do it through this. UQAM isn't necessarily complicit per se. We want to make sure it remains that way. We want to make sure that there are things within the institution that ensure that these ties that are non-existent remain unexistent. The directeur tried to say what I told you, that they don't have any ties. So what is all this fuss about? He got called out by the consulate general of Israel here in Montreal, who said, we've been meeting with you and you're like really excited to do new things with us. This is why the encampment is happening, because we can't have trust with specific individuals without having institutionalized means to ensure that ties remain severed. How could anyone sit idly by and not, do everything in their power to stop the carnage?
Things are a little bit slower now at the encampment, but essentially the main developments were that McGill has been seeking an injunction in the courts to dismantle the encampment. Since the encampment was open, McGill administration was very much in defiance of this encampment. They wanted it to be to be taken down from about the encampment was opened on a Saturday, and by the Sunday evening, McGill had already sent out an email, saying that they did not agree with this encampment. They wanted it to be dismantled. And by the Monday, an administrator or a staff member of McGill was on site and essentially announced to campers that, this was their final warning. The encampment would be dismantled, but it did come out afterwards that essentially the SPVM, Montreal Police, said that they would not dismantle this encampment. So this is why McGill has sought legal means in order to dismantle this encampment. So essentially what first happened is that McGill filed a provisional injunction in the courts, which essentially acts as an emergency injunction in order to have the encampment urgently dismantled. And they need to, within this, prove that there's an urgent need, that the encampment must be dismantled right away. So essentially McGill was unable to successfully prove that the encampment needed to urgently be demanded. And then as a result of the judge ruling in favor of the encampment rather than McGill administration, the provisional injunction did not go through. However, what I noticed is that when McGill started to move forward to the interlocutory injunction, a lot of journalists began reporting that McGill was filing a new injunction. But this actually isn't the case. This is a part of the whole process of filing an injunction. After I noticed journalists start to make mistakes around the terminology and properly describing what's happening within the courts with both McGill and the encampment, I made an explainer to just, clear up legal terminology and clear up, what this injunction is and how it works. We can take a look at the video that I made. I'm at McGill University, where protesters have just been dispersed with tear gas, and cops have been using riot tactics to try and get protesters to leave. Protesters were just blockading the administration building, escalating their tactics, demanding from McGill University to divest from companies affiliated with Israel, uphold an economic boycott, and disclose their full investments in Israel. I've just been asked to leave by police, so that's what I'm doing. Activists are still dispersing. And as far as I know, activists are still inside of the administration building.
In an email sent to the press, McGill said that they'll move forward to seek an interlocutory injunction following the decision that was made over the McGill-Gaza Solidarity encampment this week. I'll tell you what other media outlets aren't telling you and how this is only just the beginning. McGill's decision to move forward with an interlocutory injunction isn't breaking news, and it was always their intention. Just as I reported when the judgment came out Wednesday, the decision made this week was only whether the encampment had to be urgently removed or not, and that there will be a hearing next Wednesday. The May 22nd court date was already determined in McGill's first appeal, seen here. It's important to note that the upcoming interlocutory judgment isn't the final decision, and that this case has a long way to go. There are 3 injunctions included in McGill's legal quest to seek the dismantlement of the Gaza Solidarity encampment. As you can see here, there's the provisional injunction, interlocutory injunction, and the permanent injunction. The provisional injunction is the judgment that was determined this week. This decision decided whether the Gaza Solidarity encampment had to be removed urgently or not. The next judgment to be made is the interlocutory injunction. This is the injunction that McGill said that they are preparing for. It's important to note that the process for the interlocutory injunction can take months alone. After this injunction has been completed, they'll then move forward to the permanent injunction. This will determine a permanent decision on whether McGill's Gaza Solidarity encampment has to permanently be dismantled or not. Once the judgment is made on the interlocutory judgment, which is starting next week, this judgment will be held in place until a decision has been made on the permanent injunction. So currently, only 1 out of 3 injunctions have been completed within this process. The judgment made this week on the provisional injunction was because the judge didn't think that this encampment needed to urgently be dismantled. However, the judge said that if something changed on the ground that would justify urgency, the McGill could refile a provisional injunction or a safeguard order. In a statement by email, McGill said they've met with members of the encampment 6 times between May 3rd and May 10th, and added that they are committed to continuing discussions in good faith. A few days ago, I asked a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement whether members of the encampment have an upcoming meeting with McGill. They could not confirm or deny this. Campers reaffirm that they will not leave this encampment despite the threat of a police raid until their demands are met, which are for McGill to impose an academic boycott and divest from Israeli companies.
The legal process that's taking place in the courts right now for McGill to seek an injunction to have the encampment on their property dismantled. Because McGill wasn't able to successfully provide urgency with their first injunction, the current injunction, which is the interlocutory injunction, it will be a very long process. These types of injunctions are sometimes in the courts for a year. So essentially, unless the situation on the ground changes, if McGill finds evidence that they need that space vacated urgently, then they can file for another urgent provisional injunction. But as it stands now, there seems to be no movement in terms of this injunction. So we're just waiting to see the results. And before that clip, we actually watched a little preview of me on the ground. This was in early June 6th, I believe it was, where members of the encampment and supporters, pro-Palestine activists, occupied a building inside the James Administration Building on McGill University campus, essentially to escalate their demands. Their demands to McGill administration, which are to divest, disclose all their ties with Israel and ties in general, or investments to be more clear, as well as uphold an academic boycott of Israeli scholars and Israeli institutions. McGill recently put a deal on the table where they said that they would look into divesting. There were no mentions of an academic boycott, but that they also said that they would provide scholarships to support displaced scholars as well as Palestinian donors. Campers essentially first made a statement online saying that, this was not enough. And then later on, they sent an email to McGill stating that, they declined this offer and, essentially the pro-Palestine movement extending beyond the last 9 months, which has existed for many decades at McGill University and other universities in Montreal, they have themselves done the work to look into what McGill needs to divest from. So as a result, students said to McGill, essentially, we have done the work has been completed. There's no need for McGill to look into divesting. What we want you to do is divest now. So essentially, this offer that McGill made, in these students' eyes, it failed to actually meet their demands. And as a result, the students are essentially stating that they will not leave this encampment or dismantle this encampment until McGill actually meets their demands. So that's essentially the situation on the ground. And, what happened at the occupation of the James administration, a room within the James administration building on June 6th, is that students were finding that, nothing was moving forward with McGill, and they wanted to provide more pressure and really sort of escalate their tactics. So a few students and members of the public, demonstrated inside with this occupation, but outside of the administration building, there was a support rally. I was actually at this rally filming, and there was a journalist, and it was quite tense. There was a lot of people. There was heavy police presence, police in riot gear, and I was actually up. When I started to see that it was getting more intense, I actually went to go film on a fire escape because I was concerned that, tensions may continue to rise and, potentially tear gas could be used or other riot tactics. I was right. Not long after I went on the fire escape, police began to essentially release tear gas and pepper spray on protesters, and they also charged protesters, resulting them to disperse. We can take a look at that in this next video. You can see it was a very tense situation between riot police and members of the encampment. Afterwards, McGill did take the opportunity within a press release sent out to journalists by email, stating, this situation was violent, and the university reaffirms the fact that instances like this should not happen on campus, and it's another need to dismantle the encampment. Another development that's happened at McGill recently is that organizers within the encampment had essentially developed what they call a summer youth program. So within this program, they would be offering, it's free, offering to community members and students essentially Arabic classes, teachings of the history of Palestinian resistance, among other things, as well as the roots of colonialism and occupation in Palestine from British to Israeli occupation. So this was the goal with their summer youth program. It's actually still happening now. People can sign up, but essentially there was a big uproar in the media, and specifically on Twitter, with statements from politicians as a result of the photo used to promote the summer youth program. We can take a look at the photo now, essentially to just explain it. This photo is what I've been told is that it's Palestinians within the diaspora, reading essentially colonial history from China. These are the books that they're holding, and one of the Palestinians in the photo has a rifle in their hands, and this rifle is what I guess drew up a lot of tensions online. I actually have a quote by Immigration Minister Mark Miller. He tweeted, "Enough is enough. This is hate speech and incitement to hate, pure and simple. Freedom of expression and the right to protest freedom of expression and the right to protest have their reasonable limits, and they have been reached. De-escalation at McGill has clearly failed. This needs to end." And they tagged, Miller tagged both the SPVM and McGill University. So essentially, you know, within this statement, Miller is focusing on the image of a rifle, and he's stating that, you know, this incites hate. I think for context, it's really important to note that, you know, Miller himself, as I mentioned earlier, he's the Minister of Immigration, and he is essentially in control and spearheading, you know, this immigration program to bring Gazans to Canada. Under this program, not one Gazan has successfully entered Canada, you know, showing that this program is failing Gazans, and it's failing Palestinians with members of their family, you know, looking to come to Canada. So, you know, we're really seeing Miller focus on, you know, the image itself and not his role in this issue. And, you know, afterwards I spoke with members of the encampment, and a lot of the takeaway from this reaction from not just Miller but other politicians is that, you know, they shared with me that they believe politicians are focusing on violence, what they call violence in a photo, rather than focusing on actual violence that's occurring in Gaza right now, occurring in the West Bank, you know, violence that Canada is complicit in. So this is kind of their takeaway and their disappointment. So finally, we'll look at the Al-Soumoud encampment. We saw a little preview earlier, but we'll look at it again. I just want to clarify, you know, this is the first non-university or college encampment in North America. This one is actually based in Square Victoria, which is in downtown Montreal, and it seeks to apply pressure on both the provincial government to close their their office in Tel Aviv, and to apply pressure to the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, which is essentially in control of everyone's pensions in Quebec. So we can take a look at the video again.
Do you hope that this encampment could maybe set a precedent where possible other encampments, not affiliated or not on university campuses, but, you know, demanding divestments from companies and elsewhere could be set up as a result?
This is, we think, the first step of civil society mobilizing against investments that are made in their names, against in companies that are complicit with violations of international law. And we think that we call to people to join us. We think most people, if they are aware of the current investments in armaments, in crimes against human rights, most people won't agree with that. And we think that people will mobilize. They will join us, and should it be here in this encampment, in Al-Soumoud encampment, but also other forms of mobilization, other camps.
Welcome back. I have a guest with me, Kalden and Savanna. Welcome.
I'm back.
Back like you never left.
Exactly. It's been a busy month then, it seems.
It's been a busy month.
Yeah. What a close call at the James Administration Building for you.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I guess people, they kind of have like an intuition, and I really had this intuition of it's starting to seem tense. You know, let's get elevated. Let's get off the ground.
I mean, at McGill, I think you know this, but it's like at McGill you haven't had too much kind of police interventions, right? That's sort of been reserved for the UQAM encampment, which was closed down not too long after the university agreed. But this seems to be like the first kind of major, I guess, escalation of police activity at McGill, and of course this follows with the encampment also escalating their actions since the university is being very, I guess, unmoving in their position.
Absolutely.
I think another thing is interesting about what Mark Miller, the immigration minister, is saying about the image, right, of someone holding a rifle, and they're kind of like, I mean, it's a classic liberal worry of like gun control. We don't want guns in our cities, and of course that's all good and well, but it's like, what is it to me? It's so hypocritical, like this kind of being up in arms about the, like, people reading from a book where there's an image of someone holding a gun versus the actual kind of real violence. That's not just, I mean, we receive them as images, but the real violence has been enacted out in the Gaza and the West Bank, and it seems to be quite the disparity there. You know, it's incredibly selective and frustrating. Mark Miller.
It is troubling, and I think it is a way to continue to kind of demonize the movement, and specifically demonize students at this encampment, because I think they've made it very clear what they're asking for, and I think there's often some politicians and the McGill administration is waiting to take this moment, waiting each time something happens, such as this occupation of the administration, which resulted in police violence, or this photo which these politicians and administration thinks suggest violence, to kind of make a statement of, okay, that's our moment to say, you're in the wrong, you shouldn't have this encampment, here's further fuel to the fire of reasons why this encampment should be dismantled.
Of course. They're like, oh, the civility of it. They're like kind of intruding on polite society, but then I don't know. To me, it's all kind of hogwash considering what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank. It's like it's a complete different set of priorities. Where it's like it's okay to be upset about that, but you have to be upset in a certain way. You have to use certain kinds of images. There's certain kinds of things you can't do. There's like, they want you to use all the main official channels to express grievances, and through these official channels, they're also not really pressured to do anything different. So, I mean, yeah, it's not surprising.
Especially for people within this movement who are Palestinian, it's really policing them on how to grieve.
Sure, yeah. That's a good point as well. Yeah. How to grieve, how to even like process this violence being enacted on their family, relatives, people they know, neighborhoods they grew up in. Completely backwards. You'd expect people to be understanding of that, but such is life in Canada 2024. I believe you had some conversation topics for me?
I did. So, something I noted earlier is that the newest encampment, which was open on Saturday, the Al-Soumoud encampment, it's located on Square Victoria, which is, a green space in downtown Montreal. And this is not the first encampment which has been located on in this park. Essentially in 2011, the Occupy Montreal movement also hosted an encampment. I didn't live here in 2011. You have a much longer history in Montreal than I did, and I would love to kind of, compare and contrast this movement a little bit. And, I know you were younger at the time, but I would love to just kind of hear any anecdotes you have. So I guess just maybe before we kind of get into it, some facts that I can share on the protest that happened at this time is that it was this essentially, the Occupy movement, which was to apply pressure on, corporations and elites within our society, and, draw attention to class and wealth inequality. this encampment was set up in October of 2011, and it was dismantled by police in early November of 2011. So it barely lasted a month. At the time that this encampment was dismantled, 16 people were evicted. According to the CBC, no charges were laid, and I thought this was really interesting. I had to quote from the CBC. Police eventually removed the protesters, including a man dressed as Batman who allegedly tried to hug an officer. I've seen Superman at pro-Palestine protests, someone dressed in full Superman. Have not seen Batman, so maybe there's a superhero for every movement, every encampment.
During the Chilean student protests, I remember seeing someone dressed as the Joker. That was something so popular, which is, I think, in itself kind of this interesting phenomena of people drawing upon, I guess, popular figures from fiction to sort of channel their energy. It's like that's what our movement needs. Our movement needs Batman, a billionaire. Our movement needs Superman, an alien.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, especially within the Occupy movement, like a billionaire superhero.
Maybe it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. Maybe that person just had the costume and was like, when you're there, you're like, I have an audience, time to have some fun with it. Which I'm not particularly against. It's neither here nor there. I don't know how helpful it is, but I think if it raises morale a little bit and offers a little bit of fun, I think what's the harm? Mm-hmm. So the question was about, I guess, sort of like what I remember from it. So in 2011, I remember we were covering Occupy a little bit in our contemporary world history class, where we would kind of look at like events after World War II to nowadays, which is like, of course, that covers so much history. But Occupy was something that was kind of ongoing, that was kind of set to become this historical thing, and it was this big moment, I think, for social activism in North America that finally, not just North America either, I think it was Occupy happened around like 900 different cities around the world, but of course the start of it was, or at least the heart of it was Occupy Wall Street in New York City. I think this was kind of an incredibly important, I guess, early defining moment for whatever you can kind of broadly construe as like the left, or people who are sort of like anti-capitalists, as this movement tried to kind of position itself as. Of course, like with any movement, you have such a broad variety of actors and different kind of interests in it. So this is not something I actually participated in. I was very young. I think just finishing high school, starting a CEGEP. But I remember I visited the Montreal encampment at Square Victoria, because I had my uncle from France in town, and I was just showing him around the city. And for whatever reason, I decided to show him our Occupy thing. I think because of its historical significance, and I think it was the vibe seemed to be, as far as I could tell, just like kind of jubilant. It was like this big sort of like, there's tents everywhere. I think when you said 16 people were evicted. I wonder how they come up with that number, because when I visited, it was like much more than like 16 people or 16 tents even. It was like a pretty large encampment that covered a lot of the park. Yeah, I do think, in like comparing it to today's encampment, of course you have this kind of through line of like setting up tents in a sort of like public urban downtown area, right? And I think there's like parallels with the encampments today. I do think there is a markedly different, I guess, approach. You see a bit of a difference in approach. I think you have the Al-Soumoud one, which I think, to me, in terms of tactics and I guess just thinking, it seems a little more similar to the Occupy stuff than, let's say, the McGill encampment, or I think the Popular University, as they're calling it now. The whole thing about Occupy, as I understand it, was sort of this really just kind of like big kind of like, it came out of this incredible frustration, right? You had like the years after the financial crisis, you had essentially the people who caused it, like profiteers in Wall Street, stockbrokers, the kind of people who control the levers of like finance. The people who ostensibly caused it were sort of like let go without any kind of real charge, at least in North America. I know in Iceland they actually jailed the bankers, and as well as I want to say the president too, who was in charge at the time, or compared to in the United States and Canada, where people were kind of left without much kind of they were kind of just like left alone. And so I understand Occupy as a sort of reaction against that, the kind of justice that was never really received from that. And so I guess you had this broad population who was upset at the way that financial America was sort of controlling the levers of society and kind of dictating where things were going, how money was being used, and how like some of the demands. I think this is evident in some of the demands where they want more protection for corporate whistleblowers. They wanted more kind of like regulations on these companies. They didn't want really. These are people who are I guess against like this kind of like idea of like a free open market, because they saw the effects of a free open market, and more often than not it's completely oppressive towards what I'll call regular people, right? And here you had regular people from all walks of life really coming together to just at least share their grievances. Outside of sharing the grievances, I think you had this issue of what I consider of difficulty actually leveraging those grievances, right? It's like we're upset, and they kind of all got together in Wall Street, and they all got together in Square Victoria to be like, hey, listen, look at all these people who are upset. But then like it's like, what then? You know, what do you do with that? What do you do with that feeling? How do you leverage it? How do you actually like? Because when you just show up like that and you're kind of expressing your kind of feelings towards these kinds of policies, it's all well and good, and it's good that they hear this. And I think it's an incredibly important thing to show kind of like public will and collective grievances like that. But if you want it to change, then what has to be done, right? And I think that's when we can kind of compare the changes between then and now. Where for Occupy, I think it was like, in very ungenerous terms, Occupy people had these incredibly real, valid grievances, but then the actual levers of change, I think, were not really kind of thought about, or at least it wasn't really grappled with. I know because every Occupy movement was essentially its own like kind of cell. They operate on much different kind of tactics. Like I know Occupy San Francisco, a lot of the kind of ones operating out of the Bay Area, they actually went and started to do a lot more kind of like blockades. They got they got really into kind of disturbing logistics around the Bay Area, which is, I think, that's a way that they wanted to turn these kinds of demands. And they're trying to think, how do we leverage capitalism? How do we leverage the people who are in charge to sort of listen to us, right? Because it's like they're going to listen and then they can ignore and they can not take your demands. What are you going to do if they don't take in your demands? The people, if you're just in the street, in a tent, there's not much you can, I guess, really do from that position, you know, not to say there's nothing you can do at all. So yeah, you had a variety of kind of different tactics. And also, I don't want to kind of brush them all with one stroke, because you had so many different kind of people coming to this thing. And I do think it was, I guess, a good moment. I think it was a learning moment for, I guess, what mass organizing looks like in North America. Because, I mean, like, almost immediately after that, you sort of had the student strikes here in Montreal. You had, like, I mean, of course, the Arab Spring in Tunisia, across the Middle East. And, I mean, you had this whole worldwide kind of moment of, we don't like things as they are. Yeah.
Do you think, thank you for your points. Very, very interesting. Do you think that, you know, students at this encampment, both encampments here in Montreal, can they learn anything that was maybe either beneficial or could be improved within the Occupy encampment?
I think they've already done the improving. I think they've already, like, from day one, I think they already did the learning. I think I mentioned this on a previous episode, but there's a good book, If We Burn, by Vincent Bevan, that kind of looks at this movement of global unrest and strikes and protests after the 2008 financial crisis. And one thing he talks about is sort of this kind of horizontalism and leaderlessness that's sort of emphasized by people in Occupy, where it's like we're not gonna have a single leader, we're not gonna have this kind of like rigid hierarchy. Instead, we're gonna be like just all of us here together, and this collective self is like sort of what they wanted to retain by not having a leader. The common criticism I've seen that comes from that is when you don't have people who are sort of appointed, you don't have people who are selected as leaders. If you don't create this kind of hierarchy, then the people in charge, meaning like the people you're trying to be against, are going to try to create it for you. Whereas like if you go into if you try to create this leaderless horizontal movement where you don't have any representatives, a representative will emerge, one that might not be a good representative of what this larger collective wants. I think in the book, If We Burn, Vincent Bevan singles out this one person in Brazil who sort of made this list of demands. and that sort of just became the movement's list of demands, and then this person sort of became a figurehead, even though this person was not chosen by the movement, right? It was sort of something that was adopted, and it was something, it was something that sort of like just kind of came up because of this leaderlessness. Where now, if you look at, I find there's an incredible amount of discipline with the pro-Palestinian encampments, where they do have specific people who are leaders in a certain sense. You have people who are like the media spokespeople. There's a much I find the discipline is much higher than it was in the past. So like, it's absolutely not my place to be like, this is what they should do now, this is what they should learn from it, because I think already seeing how they act is a step above the sort of Occupy way of doing things. And not to say that the Occupy people did this because it was any kind of like fault. I think there was just like like naturally, as any kind of broad movement learns how to do these kinds of collective struggles, I think Occupy had to do that hard work of just like, I don't know, it's like, it's new territory, right? I think especially in North America, considering how collective activism, collective organization is sort of impeded. So this is like a generation of sort of learning from the ground, from like scratch, and those are hard lessons they had to learn. Yeah. Like I think when I think about Occupy, there's this one person, Mika White, who claims to be like, I'm the co-creator of like Occupy, and a lot of times they are kind of given that spotlight, given that kind of like representative role in reflecting on Occupy, and they ended up being he ended up being like a Trump supporter. He ended up being very much sort of like, I guess, not quite I think the best representative of broadly what Occupy was. And this sort of stuff happens when you kind of, I think, commit to this leaderlessness, which I don't believe is what the pro-Palestinian encampments are doing right now, because I think there's something incredibly, I say the word discipline, but I think it needs to be restated. Like, there's something incredibly disciplined and sharp, and they know what they're sort of leveraging for. They're leveraging for something specific from a specific organization, a body like McGill, compared to Occupy, which was a much more broader, and again, valid discomfort, unhappiness with the way things were being held. But like, you can't just broadly be unhappy. You need to know how to like, whose arms do you have to twist? Who do you have to like sort of like, when I say threaten, I don't mean like physically, of course, but I just mean like, who do you have to like kind of like make scared of, like, if what you want is going to happen, someone needs to feel the pressure. Absolutely. And I don't think the existence of an encampment creates that pressure. It seems like maybe it does for McGill though, so I could be wrong. I think people from McGill might disagree with me on that one. The McGill administration, that is.
Yeah, well, but
yeah.
Is there anything else you want to share just in regards to, stuff I covered or the Occupy movement?
I always try to think of things in like as broad terms as possible. Like, I think it's easy to get lost in the details of right now, in the kind of like, they say like the present moment is sort of blinding, where like today's struggles feel like so like today's like kind of obstacles might feel big. It's like, why can't this movement get a broader support? Why aren't they reaching further and further? But I think it is a thing of like, learning is such a slow process for that kind of stuff, and especially for something like foreign affairs, which is so far removed from people's daily lives, right? So it's like, you really have to like continue agitating, continue being visible, which is what I think both these encampments, like both Occupy and I think the pro-Palestinian encampments, do incredibly well, is they offer this kind of visual reminder to people who would otherwise be ignorant or blind to these issues, that no, this is something that's still happening. These are real kind of grievances people have about like the way our society is run, and there is a visual reminder of people who are like, of people in the streets, people in tents who are like, I'm leaving the comfort of my house, I'm here in this tent, in this public area, to remind you there are things going on that you should know about and that we are trying to actively agitate for. And I think it's good that these encampments exist. I think it's incredibly brave, and I hope they continue. But it's a tough struggle. I don't know, but I don't know. It's just, you gotta think about the big picture. You gotta think about the big picture and just try to move things as far as you can. And whatever lessons are learned from this, just try to make sure those, I guess, are carried forward for the next generation of agitators and ne'er-do-wells and people who are going to scare Mark Miller.
Specifically Mark Miller.
Trudeau's old friend.
Thank you so much, Kalden, for joining the show and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you for all the reporting you do, keeping us up to date on these affairs.
Happy to do it. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for watching. Tune in to the next show, which is at the end of July.
Yep, it's essentially it's
You gonna get into my frame? Stay in your frame.
essentially every the last Wednesday of every month. That's when Metropolis is. So just carve out a little time into your schedule and tune in.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, folks.
Take care.